evening, everyone. This is a sort of spin, but I would like you guys to know that tonight we're going to have a pretty good discussion about this past elections that came through. So I'm glad you guys wanted to tune into this as opposed to, say, going to the Norcom and Phoebus High School football game. Let me go ahead. The intro for the Beach Brothers show. You're watching the Beach Brothers show.
So look, the Beach Brothers show is a show where we deal with Virginia business and politics. We want to say thanks to Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier for their great level of sponsorship. If you need a new car, you don't need to go far. Within the so-called Black community, money circulates. In other words, stays in the community one day. In our Latino community, it stays in 1 week, 7 days. All right. And in the Asian community, 30 days. And, Jewish community, a little more than that. And then the general white community stays in there for unmeasurable amount of time. So the HR Green Book is our strategy to address the circulation. So start your search today in the HR Green Book, and let's make sure our money circulates stronger and longer. And now it's time to get beachy on the Beach Brothers show.
I think I see myself. Bear with me. To the best of our abilities, we're just going to go right into the show here to make sure that we can get through that. So let's just go ahead and bring the guests on. Again, this is on my side. This is not a Mr. They can hear me, and we're just going to go through. How about you guys introduce things a little bit? Give this a little break.
Well, Sam, I think I caught enough of what Conrad was trying to say there to get the gist of what he was getting at. I think he wanted us to I don't know. I think kind of break down what happened on last Tuesday in Virginia. So you
Yeah,
want
I
to go
think
first
before
or
that,
me?
sorry, right before that, I think we should introduce ourselves and then we can kind of jump into it. So you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Christian Heiens. I have been involved in Virginia politics in one way or another for the better part of about 11 years now. My first foray into VA politics on the professional side was in recruiting Nick Freitas to run for my seat in the Virginia House of Delegates back in 2015. I was 21 years old at the time. He won uncontested, always the best type of election to run in. I ended up going to Richmond to work for him during his first term in office. And in some capacity or the other, I have stuck around by his side ever since. I've played some role in pretty much every single campaign he's done at the state and federal level ever since. And I am now a co-host of the Making the Argument podcast with him. We put out 2 episodes every single week. We aim to put them out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We share a lot of similarities in terms of our philosophy, but we definitely have very different backgrounds between Nick and I. And outside of professional politics, I am also a giant geek and nerd when it comes to election modeling, forecasting, map making, all of that good stuff. So in 2018, I won the VPAT Pundit of the Year contest for accurately predicting the results of the midterms that year. And I've just been a huge fan of election forecasting and modeling and all of that stuff for almost as long as I've been involved in politics. So I mean, there's really not much else to share on that end other than that. Outside of politics, I'm really into history. I'm currently working on my master's in history right now. And if I stop doing politics one day, I'll probably end up pivoting and trying to become a historian.
Well, that's that sounds good. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I live in Arlington, and I have a couple kids, and hopefully they don't make too much noise. Kind of like Christian, I have an interest in Virginia politics. I'm not as professionally involved as he is, but I've mainly just post my takes on Twitter, and people tend to like them. So that's pretty much what I do. I do follow Christian. I like his history posts about military history. I also enjoy military history, although I think he knows more about it than I do. So it was fun learning from him. Other than that, that's pretty much it. I think Conrad's got some better connection now. So hopefully, I don't know if he wants to take over.
There's no lag. Sam, when we're done with this episode, if you want to like message me on Twitter or something like that, I don't know if I follow you or not. I'd love to follow you back.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that sounds good. We can touch on offline. I try to. Well, I'm not. I come from the other political side, but I try not to be too political on my Twitter. So hopefully,
I didn't even care about that. I appreciate anybody who says that they enjoy the history takes that I put out is a fan in my book.
I don't post on military history, but I do enjoy it, and it'd be nice to compare notes at some point. So anyways, yeah, we can do that after the show.
All right, so hopefully you guys were able to bear with me during my little fiasco here on the laptop. So I just switched to the cell phone. Can you guys hear me pretty good on the cell phone?
Perfect.
Good. And hopefully it just seems like I'm not spinning in a circle like I've been doing. So hopefully you guys were able to introduce yourselves in my relative absence, because I could neither see nor hear you at the time. And let's go into the first question here. Again, I'm doing this through the Facebook chat that we guys had earlier. All right. So in late October and early November, what was the political temperature of the nation going into the general election nationwide? Let's go with nationwide, and let's start with Mr. Christian.
Oh boy. So nationwide, I mean, in retrospect, the temperature, I think, was a lot different than I think either party necessarily realized. Certainly on the Republican side, I know a lot of people were really caught up in the idea of a red wave, which is very funny because I was one of them, although I had resisted it all the way until probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks before the election. I remember in September and August, I was thinking to myself and telling close friends of mine, like, there's not going to be a red wave. Like, the Senate's going to stay in Democrat hands. The House will flip because that is guaranteed to flip. That, I mean, the way that the House was set up, it was virtually impossible for Democrats to hold the chamber no matter what they did. I mean, they could have run perfect campaigns everywhere, and it still would have almost certainly flipped. But the Senate was a completely different beast. And I remember being very bearish on Republican chances in the like early, mid, and late summer. But really, like the last 2 weeks before the election, you had, I mean, a lot of polls were being herded from mostly Republican leaning pollsters. Trafalgar kind of really led the way on that front. And I trusted a lot of them because Trafalgar had accurately called Virginia in 2021 virtually within a single point. And they got a lot of flack for that before. And I remember telling people, like, Trafalgar is a much more serious pollster than people give them credit for because of what happened in Virginia in 2021. But they were definitely off the mark this year in a lot of states, or at least a lot of key swing states on the Senate side. So on my end, I was really torn. Like, my heart said one thing and my head said another thing. And I think I ended up going with that, with the heart. And I paid dearly for it in terms of my own personal predictions. But I think in the wider sense, the mood of the country really in late October, November, I think was a combination of fatigue and anxiety. You had a lot of fatigue from just, the nature of midterm elections in general. But I think you also had a lot of anxiety. I mean, there were there still are, significant troubles within the stock market, the bond market, the general financial situation. Inflation hasn't really been improving that much. Gas prices remained elevated. There was a lot of negative news that should have necessarily played into, Republican strengths, but in retrospect, it didn't. And I think we might actually, have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about why it didn't. And it's not necessarily that it failed, right? I mean, Republicans did flip the House, but it didn't translate into the sort of red wave that a lot of people were expecting. So I think that the mood was, to sum it up, a combination of fatigue and anxiety, which didn't necessarily play into a massive Republican win, despite the fact that you might think that those two things would.
Yeah, I think those are valid points. And if I could add to that, one thing in politics is always the expectations game, and Democrats just tend to be super pessimistic, super kind of, oh, we're going to lose. That's maybe it's a hangover from 2016, but it's just kind of the mood is always there, even if things are looking good. And obviously this year things weren't necessarily looking good. So I think it's partly the expectations. And at the end, maybe it was all the Republican pollsters, maybe it was, just the media hyping things up. There was really kind of a expectation, okay, this is going to be a red wave. And it didn't, when things weren't that bad for Democrats, I think it kind of flipped, and the expectations were not met in terms of the red wave. Now, that's not to say that things were perfect for Democrats. I think in some ways it was a mixed decision. There were some states, particularly, where Democrats didn't do well. And that's the other thing. We talk about these national trends, but it's really kind of 50 different elections in 50 different states. And some states, Democrats did pretty poorly, like in New York. Some states, they did really well, like Michigan and Pennsylvania. So it's hard to kind of overgeneralize, but I think the key was just the expectations. Everyone was going in that Democrats were going to get slaughtered. It didn't happen. Doesn't mean Democrats had the best night ever, but it definitely, the expectations, I think, what shaped a lot of people's opinion of the night.
Oh, Conrad, you're muted for us.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I'm going to try and get in the first overlay that I have for you guys to read and react to. And I think it touches on the national sentiment here. And again, this is from me, which means that I report my own bias here. I'm more of a progressive person. So if I read something like they were lying, Republicans understand that if you can influence the information space, you can influence behavior. I think the goal was to suppress turnout for these by making the red wave seem inevitable. And here's the thing I would say with that. As you were pointing out, Christian, it's not necessarily that you guys even felt that it was inevitable. But perhaps when you watch more I watch a lot of comedic versions of taking in my echo chamber, it's more comedy and a Democrat flavor, and it's sort of reporting all the Republicans who are trying to say that it's this big, massive wave coming. And maybe on the ground, it didn't really feel like that. And I wonder if that is also something that you probably already touched on it a bit, but maybe Mr. Sam, did it feel like that it was portrayed as bigger than it should have been?
Do you want me to go or Sam to go?
Well, say I trailed off to Sam, but yes.
Oh,
Sam.
I'm sorry. I can go first. Sorry, I wasn't sure. Yeah, I mean, I think so. A couple of things. I think those of us who are really into this and probably spend too much time on Twitter or other places, we tend to follow the ins and outs really closely. I mean, frankly, I don't know how many regular people were aware of these, Trafalgar or all these other things. I mean, a lot of people are just kind of going day to day. So I tend not to necessarily think too much about the pundits influencing voting behavior. I mean, if anything, it probably, I don't know. I don't know if it motivated Democrats because they were worried that the wave would be so large. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is really interesting for political people. I question how much people in the real world are influenced by it. I mean, that's not to say that they don't follow what's going on. They have their opinions, but the kind of horse race coverage, I just don't know how much of it impacts like the final outcome. But I don't know. Maybe Christian has a different opinion.
I think I completely agree with Sam. I mean, this stuff is, again, like my bread and butter. I enjoy this stuff, but I don't necessarily know if I agree with that tweet. I mean, first off, Twitter is its own universe in the sense that, Twitter is complete. And we know this from both sides. We know this across the political spectrum that Twitter is completely disconnected from reality in many respects, even outside of politics. It's only a fraction of Americans that use Twitter or check Twitter every single day. So I also think it kind of gives too much credit to Republicans. The idea that there was some sort of concerted effort by Republicans, this top-down approach to kind of push a narrative in order to decrease Democrat turnout. I mean, if that was the case, then why don't Republicans just do that every single election cycle? Like why didn't they do that in 2018 when it was clearly a blue wave? So I don't agree with that, but I don't agree with it, for like malicious reasons. I just don't agree with it because for many of the reasons that Sam pointed out, I don't necessarily think that the average voter, regardless of their party affiliation, regardless of their philosophical or political views, just the average voter, left or right, I don't necessarily know if they pay that much attention to pollsters or pundits like myself or Sam. I mean, they've got other stuff going on in their lives. They've got their families and their jobs. And I mean, most people treat elections as something that, they come around once every 2 or 4 years and they'll tune in after, after Labor Day or sometime in late October. And they've just got other stuff going on. And that doesn't necessarily, we have to be careful when we say this too, because that's not a ding against them. That's not, me saying, oh, these stupid voters don't know, that, shouldn't they know that they should pay attention to the Trafalgar poll? Like, there's a reason that people only allocate a certain amount of attention and time to politics. And it's because they have more important things in their lives that they care about. And I mean, again, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in many ways, like, thank God that people aren't as obsessed about this stuff as we are. So, no, I think I totally agree with Sam's take that this wasn't necessarily like a top-down thing. This wasn't a, concerted effort. It was, I mean, look, the polls were wrong in 2016. They were wrong in 2020, and they were wrong in 2022. I mean, it's a common occurrence. The big difference this time was just simply that they overshot Republicans, whereas the previous 2 cycles, they had overshot Democrats.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on that in just a second, but I also want to piggyback off what you mentioned, that a lot of the turnout is probably, as you mentioned, that the people who they definitely know they want to vote, but they're not as informed as, ourselves. Christian, Sam are like more informed than even I. And I like to think that I'm into this because this is the type of thing that I look at day to day. And I point to the fact that when I was at a poll on election day, right outside Kellam High School to support one of my friends running for city council, there was a woman who came up. She was clearly wearing her Trump 2024 hat, but she didn't exactly know what to do with the rest of the ballot. And right next to me was a more of a conservative Republican person also happening to run for that city council seat. So she got to her first. She was able to break down what the rest of the ballot meant. And she was going to pass me to get to the door. And I said, I think you took the right person to ask about that. And I think that person felt like they learned a little bit and that they felt justified in coming to the poll that day. And I think that's just what a lot of people do. They don't really know, but they felt that they have to, which I'm still glad about that. I like to have millions and millions of people voting. That just sounds better that, as opposed to not having a good turnout at all. And again, that was just in my little section at Virginia Beach. As we move into Virginia, do you think the national sentiment checked down into Virginia too, or it's somewhat changed a little bit? Let's start with Mr. Sam on this one. Do you think Virginia was different than the nation as a pre-election sentiment?
I think it was a little bit different in that Republicans were very optimistic, and I think towards the end felt like, oh, this is going to be 2021 over again. I think 2020 was a really good year for Democrats in Virginia, and then we had whiplash. 2021 was a really good year for Republicans, and I think this year was a little bit more of a mixed verdict, kind of somewhere in between. Obviously the second district down in Hampton Roads where you are flipped, but the seventh closer to Northern Virginia and Central Virginia didn't flip. So I think I don't think either party had a super great night in Virginia. It was kind of a normal-ish election. There wasn't a wave either way, which is kind of what you would expect, given that Virginia is kind of in the middle and is not is still kind of a swingy type state. So, anyways, all that's to say is, personally, I thought that's where Virginia would end up. I thought Virginia would be a little bit more in the middle, and that's what ended up happening. So I think I actually was not super surprised by the Virginia results, even though some of the other states were a little bit more surprising for me.
And were you, Christian?
I think that Virginia was definitely a microcosm of the country. It really was a slice of what happened nationally, because what you saw in Virginia, and if you add up like the results of every single House race in Virginia, it's very, very close to 50-50. Virginia was obviously a little bit to the left of the entire country. Republicans won the House popular vote, and in Virginia, they narrowly lost it by about a point or two. But it certainly wasn't like a 10-point, 11-point defeat like it was in 2020. And it also wasn't a 2-point Republican victory like in 2021. So to Sam's point, we saw certainly a blue wave in Virginia in 2020. We certainly saw a red wave in Virginia in 2021. And in 2022, I don't know what you could call it, a purple wave. I mean, my point is that what happened in Virginia is really a microcosm of what happened in the entire country, right? Republicans did flip a seat, right? They flipped, Loria's seat in Virginia Beach and Hampton Roads in Chesapeake, but they didn't flip the 7th. They didn't flip the 10th, but they did tremendously better in the 10th than what the historical records suggested, which is kind of reminiscent to what happened in, say, New York, right? Where they didn't flip the governorship in New York, but they certainly did a much better job there than they had in previous cycles. So I think that there's little bits and pieces that you can take from Virginia that apply to other states entirely. That's why I say that Virginia is kind of a microcosm of what happened in the entire country. When you add all of that up together, the result that you end up getting is, again, a step or two more to the left of what the actual national results were, but taken as a whole, pretty much just a combination of everything. It really was. You could argue that it was a wash. I mean, you could argue it was a very mild Republican victory in Virginia because they did flip a district. But I mean, to Sam's point, I think that he kind of hit the nail on the head when he said that, it really was certainly not a repeat of 2020 or 2021.
And I wonder, because I would like to think that we might be able to touch on the differences between some of these districts in a second or two. But we want to move on now to the idea of what turnout looked like. And let's start with the election day portion. Mr. Christian, I know you did a show that night and reporting in the results as you saw them, but what did it feel like on the ground on election day to you?
So this was actually quite funny. This was my worst defeat and greatest triumph simultaneously. And here's what I mean by that. when I was so obviously I was on the ground in Culpeper County in the 7th district. This is my home. And I saw firsthand that turnout was suggesting that, oh, this is going to be a repeat of 2021. Vega might actually pull this thing out. And I was tweeting the entire afternoon, like, unless the Spamberger campaign is pulling off an amazing GOTV effort right now in Prince William County, they're going to lose just out of what I'm seeing here in the western side of the district. And I ended up being humiliated from that decision because I was predicting from turnout, it was looking like Vega was going to win. But that was because I was getting news of turnout at, noon, 1 p.m., 2, 3, 4, 5. I wasn't getting news out of Prince William County. But then when I saw the results coming in, literally within half an hour of the polls closing, and I started seeing the election day numbers trickle in one precinct at a time in Prince William County, I was able to make the call that Spamberger was going to win re-election an hour before anyone else in the entire Commonwealth of Virginia had. And the reason why was because I was looking at the election day turnout that was happening in Prince William County, in the county that I had basically been shut out from in terms of information that entire afternoon. So the story, I think, in the 7th district, and this is, kind of credit to Spamberger's campaign, was that, quite frankly, if they had not gotten the election day turnout that they got in Prince William County, she would have lost. You can just look at the numbers from just election day turnout alone in counties like Prince William and Stafford, but really Prince William in particular. And you can see that Spamberger's campaign pulled off an amazing knock and drag campaign. They really just hit it out of the park in terms of GOTV efforts. And had they not done that, I really think that we'd be looking at a situation where Yesli Vega would be taking office in just a few months. So it really was a surprising, and in some ways it's surprising, but in other ways it's not, because the final results in the 7th actually match up almost perfectly with the historical trend, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how Virginia, really was a microcosm of the entire country. And there wasn't anything actually extremely shocking when you look at the overall results. You could argue the 10th district was surprising because Republicans did do significantly better there. But in the 7th, I think that really the story is that the data on the ground in these western and southern counties on election day were pointing to a Vega victory. But really, like the last 2 to 3 hours of the polls being open, Spamberger's campaign got their people to the polls in places where she needed them to get to the polls to, and she was able to pull off a win that wasn't an upset win, but it was starting to look like an upset, like I said, until really like about 4 p.m. that evening or afternoon.
As you know, I'm in Virginia Beach, Christian's in Culpeper. Sam, you're part of Virginia. Did sort of similar sentiments hold on the actual election day for yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm in a very safe blue seat. I can tell you that I can speak to the 7th. A couple observations. One, I think one advantage Spamberger had, and Christian touched on this, is she had much more of a ground game. I think Vega was relying more on kind of the Youngkin organization and kind of having rallies with him, which doesn't necessarily turn out. I mean, so it sounded like that worked, even though she didn't necessarily have the boots on the ground in getting their voters out. But Spamberger had a decent kind of number of volunteers who were out there knocking doors. And while I agree that she got her voters out in Prince William, it wasn't just that she got them out. Is she kept? Some other people ran the numbers, and I'll trust them. Is she actually did better than Biden in that portion of Prince William County? So she improved on 2020 performance in Prince William County, and that, I mean, I don't want to criticize Vega too much, but I mean, she's from Prince William County, so I think that was the big surprise. Like Spamberger, it wasn't just getting her people out. It was the margin in Prince William County that was really surprising, because, it's a big county and the margins matter. And she was able to really hit it out of the park, and it made up for some of the other parts of the county. For example, like Stafford, a lot of people thought Spamberger might narrowly carry. Vega actually carried Stafford, which I think was a surprise that, in favor of Vega. But anyways, overall, I agree with Christian. The only thing I'll add is it's not just the turnout. It was the margin in Prince William, given that it was Vega's home county, and Spamberger had really no connection to Prince William before redistricting. So anyways, I think those two things really helped put her over the top.
Well, that was election day. Let's touch on a little bit about and this is I don't know if anyone else is going to be coining it this way, but more of an election season now that we have such prodigious early voting. Is it still where you just sort of bank on the fact that it's going to be a massive amount of Democrat numbers in the early voting section? Let's start with Mr. Sam here on that one.
Yeah, so this was a slight change from 2021. I think a lot of credit to Youngkin in 2021. He really emphasized the early vote, and I think he tried to do some of those rallies to help get the early vote numbers up for Republicans this year, and I think they helped. But the in-person early vote was slightly more Democratic than it was last year, and the mail vote is always going to be very Democratic, basically for the foreseeable future. So I think that was a slight advantage Democrats had this year. Now you can say, well, early vote, election day vote, it doesn't really matter. It's a vote banked either way. But to Christian's point, I think when you bank more early vote, you can focus your GOTV on election day on the, you basically, you have a list of who hasn't voted, who hasn't voted. So you can call those people, knock those doors. So, I mean, I don't think it necessarily made the difference, but there was a slight change in that Youngkin did have a very good early vote operation. And I think some of the, not just Virginia Republicans, but Republicans across the country didn't quite take advantage of early vote. And Democrats have been focusing on early vote for a long time. So they start off with an advantage. But anyways, I mean, I don't think it made the difference, but it kind of went back to historical patterns, at least in Virginia.
Do you feel similar, Mr. Christian?
I think that, so Virginia, the historical context is that until relatively recently, early vote was just not a thing in Virginia. There was not a significant number of people that had been early voting in Virginia historically, which is in stark contrast to many other states out there. It really has only been within the last 5 years, really within the last 2 or 3 years, that early vote has increased dramatically. You can go back to 2017 or 2018, let alone 2016 or earlier, and you can find that it's just a paltry number of early voters compared to what we're seeing now. That is again, like I said, that's in stark contrast to what we see in other states. And I think the weakness that Republicans had in this cycle, which was not a weakness that was impossible to overcome, by the way. In fact, they did overcome it in the 2nd district. But I think the weakness that Republicans had is this hesitancy to embrace early voting as a new tool to bank votes. As Sam pointed out, like, when you identify your party's loyal cohorts, why would you not want them to get to the polls earlier? So that way you can spend time and resources either convincing swing voters or getting your lower propensity voters out to vote on election day. And this is really the strategy that Republicans perfected in Florida, right? Republicans outvoted Democrats in Miami-Dade County in the early vote. Miami-Dade. Republicans have no such, network or system in place to replicate what you saw in Florida in Virginia currently. Now, I can tell you, personally, after this election, I know that there's a lot more Republicans, and I'd be really interested to see how this plays out in 2 years. I know there's a lot more Republicans that have started to open up to the idea of embracing early voting, which is something that was considered absolute heresy in 2020. It wasn't even considered in 2018. There was just no concept of it in 2018. And it was considered absolute heresy in 2020. And then in 2022, it wasn't quite considered absolute heresy, but it was definitely still viewed at with suspicion, and certainly unfamiliarity. And I think that that's starting to change, in large part because Republicans have seen that in race after race, they're losing races that they don't think that they should be losing. Now, I know that there's going to be a segment of people that are going to say that every single race is being lost because of voter fraud. And obviously we know that that's not the case. But I do think that other Republican operatives, campaign workers, volunteers, Twitter personalities, I think that there's a growing element within the party that is starting to say we need to invest heavily into early voting. We need to replicate the Florida model that has been so successful for DeSantis down there and the rest of the Republican Party of Florida. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what will happen in 2024, because I'm willing to bet that the early vote numbers, this will be an early prediction, I'm willing to bet that Republicans will not lose the early vote in 2024, by the same margin that they lost it by in 2020. Now, obviously, that's a super low bar to clear, but it's one that I genuinely think that they will end up. Again, I make no predictions that they're going to win the early vote, right? I don't think they're going to get Miami-Dade numbers, but I certainly think that the party's going to slowly start moving in this direction where they're going to be more open to the idea of pushing it than they have been in the past.
I just saw it today, and on the drive over from work, and meme. Yeah, I text and drive, so that's. I don't suggest people text and drive, but I saw a meme that was shared on my feed, and it had a moving van, and it was a woman carrying big old blocks, and it said a new batch of votings in Arizona came through, or something like that. I'm like, that's the sentiment that needs to be sort of quickly changed out, if we can do that, to make sure that both Republicans and Democrats treat the idea of going to the polls before literal election day is actually a good thing. It'll help out turnout both for the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think you would both agree that the past few years and cycles have actually had just greater turnouts overall, and that's probably a lot to do with the big election season of the early vote. And I know I early voted, and I don't know if you guys did too, because we're all doing our things politically. We don't want to be doing that exactly on election day when we're helping out other people. So we probably all took the trip on down to wherever the early voting location was, or did a mail-in or something like that. How about number 5? And let's discuss the breakdown of results in the nation first. And we're going to move on to Virginia second. But based on what you thought going in, and based on what you saw either election night or the next day, what do you draw from that? And let's start with Christian again.
So I want to start with Florida because I nailed that state perfectly. I remember predicting back in March that DeSantis was going to carry Palm Beach County, which would have just been, I mean, if I had mentioned that 5 years ago, people would have laughed in my face. In fact, people laughed in my face this year when I said that he was going to win Palm Beach County. And he did. So I think that Florida was certainly one of a handful of states that did absolutely experience a red wave. There is no doubt about it. I mean, we're talking about a state that was decided by less than 600 votes in the 2000 presidential election, ultimately going almost 20 points for a Republican governor. I mean, that's the largest margin for a Republican governor in that state running for election in over 150 years. I mean, it was such a large margin that, I mean, I know that there's plenty of Democrats that have basically already written off Florida altogether in 2024, which might not necessarily be a great strategy considering that Florida has, 30 electoral votes and there's plenty of House seats there that Democrats, quite frankly, have to flip if they want to take back the House or if they want to increase their odds of taking back the House. There's certainly some districts down in Miami-Dade and some of the Tampa Bay area that could be competitive, but I think that Florida was certainly a case of a red wave, and we can go into reasons why. I also think that New York was a case of a red wave. And so it's kind of interesting that you had a former swing state that had arguably been trending slightly to the right since 2016, go massively to the right in 2022 in the case of Florida. And then you had a solid blue state that had been blue my entire life and hadn't had a Republican governor in something like 20 years. Also move massively to the right. Not enough to flip it, right? But certainly enough to flip 4 congressional seats. So Lee Zeldin didn't win in Florida, not Florida, in New York, obviously. But he came much closer than any Republican has in basically a generation. And in doing so, he kind of had coattails as a losing candidate. He had coattails that helped Republicans. I don't think he was the only cause behind this, but he certainly helped Republicans in many of these districts that, I mean, quite frankly, I don't think Republicans were expecting to flip districts that were in Queens, right? I don't think that Republicans were expecting to beat Sean Patrick Maloney, who's was the head of the DCCC until he lost. So it's kind of interesting that in one of the bluest states in America, there was a massive shift to the right. And in a state that had previously been a swing state, but had slowly been shifting to the right for the past 5 or 6 years or so, just suddenly lurched to the right massively. But then what you saw in arguably purple state America was there was no red wave. So Republicans made really large gains in places that were heavily Republican already to begin with, or heavily Democrat to begin with. I haven't even gotten into the actual results within the 5 boroughs of New York City, which each moved massively to the right as well. I think it was something like Queens shifted like 20 points to the right or something like that. So like in some of the bluest places in America and some of the reddest places in America, there was a red wave. But that doesn't necessarily translate into seats being picked up, right? Because the red seats are already held by Republicans. In the deep, deep blue seats, here's an example, AOC's district. She performed something like 24 points worse in her seat than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. But that doesn't mean that she lost re-election, right? It just means that, her seat goes from being almost 90% Democrat to barely 70% Democrat. That doesn't translate into a pickup for Republicans. So it wasn't necessarily a huge benefit for the GOP that they were doing much better in the already really red or really blue places. In fact, it hurt Republicans that in the really purple places, they didn't really improve at all. And in some cases, they kind of backslided. A good example of this is the 1st district in Ohio, where a Republican incumbent lost re-election. Another example is the 9th district in Ohio, where the Democrat incumbent in a Trump won seat won re-election pretty handily. There's plenty of other examples. I think it's the 13th district that's in the Raleigh metro area, North Carolina, that Republicans were expecting to win, and they didn't. It was a very, very close district drawn. It's drawn to be basically a swing district, and Republicans were stunned to lose that seat. So like there, and I can throw out some other examples too, but the point is that like in the closest seats in America that had only barely voted for Joe Biden, Republicans improved very little. But in some of the bluest seats in America and in some of the reddest seats in America, Republicans improved massively. So I think that's why we saw the results that we saw in terms of the map, because you could look at the map and you could look at the vote margins. And if I told you that Republicans would win the House popular vote by a solid 3 points, most people would say, oh, well, then, they would be picking up, 225 to 230 plus seats. Maybe even more than 230 seats. But then if I told you Republicans barely won the House, you probably would be saying, oh, so it was basically a split even ballot, right? Republicans, maybe won the popular vote by a fraction of a point, maybe even lost the popular vote. But, they certainly wouldn't have won it by, 3+ points. So when you look at the results of the House popular vote with the actual district results, it kind of looks like a paradox, which is what kind of threw a lot of people off looking at the results of this election.
Sam, I want to know if you want to think that the national sentiment since this point is that it is some instances that are unique and paradoxical, as he just mentioned, or is there another, maybe national trendy take that you think we can deduce from this past election?
Yeah, so I think to maybe tell a little bit more about the Democratic story. I mean, I agree that Republicans did well in some places they didn't really need to do well, and Democrats tended to do well in places they needed to do well. And I think some bright spots for Democrats was the Rust Belt in general. I think were Democrats, which had been bleeding support for a long time, people were pretty happy with, and then also, I don't know how you describe it, kind of the Mountain West, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. And I think there was kind of a combination of, we haven't talked about the overturning of Roe yet. I think that was part of it. I also think, some of the candidates the Republicans ran were just not very good, particularly at the Senate level. So I think that those were really the bright spots, particularly if you look at places like Michigan. I mean, it basically was a blue wave where they were able to flip the state house for like the first time, I don't know, in 40 years, and win most of the House seats that they were contesting, and win big in the governor's race. And that one pretty clearly was all down to the abortion referendum on the ballot, where that clearly drove Democratic turnout. So, obviously there were some really good results for Republicans in Florida and New York, but there were some really good results for Democrats in places like Michigan or Colorado. So I think all that's to say is that part of it is a regional thing, but I think part of it is also candidate quality and the issues that were on the ballot in terms of referendums and other things. So not an easy midterm to kind of summarize in a sentence, red wave, blue wave. It really was a little bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I can't say that we tied Right. It's not like that.
I remember somebody once said, I can't remember who said it on Twitter, but somebody was like, "This is the first election of my lifetime where both sides are massively disappointed."
Yeah.
Which I think in some ways is kind of true.
Yeah. Well, in the sense that me, the Democrat, possibly Sam as well, we want to think that we're going to come out the end of this still holding the House and gain the Senate. And pair that with the presidency, man, we're going to feel good to going into December and January before, this is Virginia. We go into our state races and we have to switch focus. But maybe we both feel disappointed. Or maybe, as you mentioned, using Florida as a model and New York as a model, Republicans in Virginia should have a whole new mindset going into next year, or not. I don't know. In fact, that's part of what the next follow-up of this question will be. When we just discussed the breakdown of the results, let's break down the state of Virginia in terms of the national races, all the congressional things here in Virginia, from Kiggins all the way to the west, Wise County. Let's start with Mr. Sam. What are some bright spots, low spots, things that really, drive your imagination regarding this past election day?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Democrats, the bright spot really was the 7th. I mean, we've talked about it. I think the fact that Spanberger was able to hang on. I think one thing about the 2nd, and Kiggins ran a pretty disciplined race. She was able to flip it. I do think it was made somewhat more Republican during redistricting, which helped her out. It would have been a pretty close race. It was closer to the lines that were used last decade, and I think Laurier ran she knew she was having a tough race, but she still put up a fight. So I think Democrats are relatively happy in Hampton Roads, even though that sleep flipped, mainly because Hampton Roads swings a lot, and it was more of a kind of subdued swing, enough to kind of get Kiggins a decent win, but it wasn't a complete. I think Youngkin won the 2nd by like over 10 points. So Laurier kind of stood her ground. I think, as Christian mentioned, the 10th, it was down into single digits, which honestly doesn't surprise me a lot. I think 2020 made Virginia look a lot bluer than it was because Trump was so unpopular, particularly in Nova. I mean, Trump in Nova was just, toxic. And so the 10th had some crazy numbers in 2020, mainly because of Trump. I know it's changed under redistricting, but it's basically a similar lean district. And so I think 2022 was kind of a snapback to reality, where Virginia is maybe this light blue state. Democrats on a normal election will tend to get more votes. And it'll be curious to see what goes on in 2023 and 2024, particularly with how serious the Republicans are in contesting the presidential race here. Because I think Republicans always want to say, like, we're going to contest Virginia. And it really hasn't been close since 2012, or at least really up in the air since 2012. So we'll see what 2024 holds in store. But I do think Virginia kind of went back to its light blue, ever slowed to the center left. And we'll see what happens. And it really depends on who the nominee is in 2024. And anyways, so all that's to say is I think neither party was super happy, as we mentioned, both nationally and in Virginia, I think.
Your thoughts, Mr. Christian, on Virginia?
I think I agree almost completely with what Sam said. One thing that I thought was really interesting was that Loretta won Virginia Beach. I do think that a good chunk of that is because of the power of incumbency. Virginia Beach is very reliant on the federal government, especially through its connections with the military. So I think that there's more voters in Virginia Beach, not an overwhelmingly number, right? But I do think that there's a good chunk of voters that are more potentially inclined to support an incumbent that's in Congress because of those connections and the seniority that comes along with that. And the fact that, again, there's a lot of federal money that flows into Virginia Beach, which again, that might have been at least part of the reason that Loretta won Virginia Beach. I certainly don't think that is the whole story, but I just found that really fascinating that Loretta did win Virginia Beach, because I know that Democrats have always kind of been upset at how Virginia Beach had been a little bit more to the right of the rest of the state. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. Virginia Beach is probably maybe not perfectly in line with the state as a whole, but it's definitely gotten more competitive. And so that's a bright spot that Democrats have in an otherwise disappointing election cycle in that part of the state.
And if I pause you for 1 second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm looking right here. My screen's black, of course, because I get off the phone to go to Safari to look at the elections website here. And Loria had about 81,421 total votes in the city of Virginia Beach. And Jen Kickens had 81,016. So it was still 50.05 to 49.80. And as you were speaking, and then I want you to get back to what you were saying after I'm done with this. Last year, Youngkin won the city of Virginia Beach. And going into state races, I know the Democrats like to say that, because I associate with the Democrats, I hang out with them and all their candidates, that they tell each other that, hey, Virginia Beach is the swing district. That's the one that'll determine whether or not we pick up the House or lose the House of delegates. And it sort of ended up that way when we got like Greenlaw, who replaced Askew and such, that Virginia Beach is sort of like, okay, 1 year it's this, 1 year it's that, 1 year it's this, 1 year it's that. And I wonder if that's a trend or if that's just 2 years of weirdness.
I think it's kind of a little bit of both. I mean, the macro trend has been that Virginia Beach has moved to the left, since the beginning of this millennium. But that's not necessarily indicative of what the future will hold, right? Because you could go back in time and you could say, oh man, Florida is going to just be the swing state for the century. And well, I mean, again, it looks like that's kind of out the window right now. So, larger trends, especially the further back that you go, aren't necessarily indicative of what will happen in the future. But I definitely think that Virginia Beach will remain competitive, certainly in the House of Delegates, because you have to understand that, and you do understand this, but like individual House seats in Virginia Beach are not necessarily indicative of the entire city as a whole. Right.
Correct.
So you could have Virginia, for example, Virginia Beach could be, let's say R+3 in a certain year, but that doesn't mean that every single House district in Virginia Beach is going to be R+3. There could be swing districts in Virginia Beach that could determine the fate of the entire House of Delegates, even if Virginia Beach as a whole is to the right of the state. So, I mean, I think that that's kind of like the summary of what I've got to say when it comes to Hampton Roads in general. But, I actually think the biggest disappointment for Democrats on a macro level wasn't actually what happened in Virginia Beach. I think it's what happened in the 10th district. Sam kind of alluded to this earlier when he said that, it maybe we have at least 2 cycles of evidence now for this. Maybe Trump was an anomaly in terms of pushing Virginia very far to the left while he was in office, right? While he was a dominant political force, because before Trump, Virginia was one of the key swing states in the entire country. It was a state that voted perfectly in line with the federal results in both 2018 and in 2012. And then Trump came along and the bottom fell out for Republicans, basically. So if Trump is gone, and there's no guarantee that that will be the case, right? He just announced that he's running for president again a few days ago, right? But if Trump loses the nomination in 2024 to say DeSantis or really anybody, it would be really fascinating to see if Republicans make any sort of play in Virginia. I don't necessarily think they will target it as like the, state that will give them their 270th electoral vote. I think that it's probably more likely that that's going to be a state like Wisconsin, Arizona, or Pennsylvania, or possibly Georgia. But it would be fascinating to see if Virginia shifts, even if it still votes for Joe Biden in 2024, assuming Biden is still the nominee. It would be fascinating to see if Virginia shifts to the right compared to its results in 2020. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if insert any Republican here other than Donald Trump as the nominee does better than Trump did in 2020. I mean, granted, in some ways that's a really low bar to clear. But it would be fascinating to see if Virginia kind of reverts back to its traditional roots that we all kind of grew up with, where Virginia was a purple state that had a slight tinge of blue. And I really do think that 2021 and 2022, for different reasons, really helped to remind people that Virginia is not a, D+8 state. It's not Connecticut. Virginia is a purple state that is a slight tinge of blue. In 2021, with Youngkin's victory and Republicans flipping the House of Delegates, reminded Democrats that, oh, we're not just guaranteed to win every single election in Virginia until the end of time. And likewise, 2022 reminded Republicans that, oh, Virginia has not just become a red state overnight, right? And so both parties have a reason to invest in this state. Both parties have a reason to take statewide elections seriously in Virginia. Both parties have a reason to take House of Representatives elections seriously in Virginia. And both parties have a reason to care about elections when it comes to the state legislature of Virginia, like we're going to see coming up next year.
All right, let me unmute myself. Now, before we get to my last prepared question, which I think is going to wrap up regarding messaging as a concept going forward, let me go ahead and get these last inlays out, and I want you guys to read them, and then just, if you have a visceral reaction or not, or be like, hey, whatever. These are ones that I thought that would be pertinent to today. So let's see the first one. It's not showing fast enough on the laptop. Okay.
Is it just kind of up in the air for who goes?
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. I can I'll just give my quick response because I know we're running out of time. I mean, there's a lot going on in that. I think it's always a good idea for either party, but particularly Democrats, to never take anything for granted and to never assume, you're going to win. And if, there was 2016 taught Democrats a lesson, and I think 2022 taught Republicans a little bit of a lesson. So I think it's good to have some humility and never assume you're going to win, and always work like you're probably going to lose, because that's the best way to motivate yourself to work hard.
Your thoughts, Christian?
I mean, there's two ways to just completely refute what this guy has to say. The first off, extreme gerrymandering, that's a complete myth. We can just look at the maps out there. There's no way that anybody could argue that the House maps as a whole for the entire House of Representatives is more Republican leaning than last decade's maps were. There's no way that anybody can make that argument. Joe Biden won a majority of the House seats that exist in this country right now in 2020. So, I mean, that right there is basically just a myth. I won't even get into the rest of them, but I will remind people that that same logic could be applied in reverse after the 2010 elections. There's no way that Barack Obama could win re-election after his party got absolutely blown out of the water in both chambers of Congress and Republicans picked up over 60 seats in the House of Representatives. 2012 is going to be the biggest red wave since 1980. I'm old enough to remember when Republicans were making that argument in 2011. I'm old enough to remember when they were making that argument in 2012, even with Mitt Romney. I remember Republicans thinking that Mitt Romney, it's kind of amazing now considering the treatment that he gets, but yeah. I remember when Republicans were thinking that Mitt Romney was going to be the second coming of Ronald Reagan, that he was going to win in an absolute landslide. It was like Dick Morris that was saying he was going to win like Minnesota and stuff like that. So
listening to that, yeah.
Yeah. So long story short, there is no correlation between midterm election results. Here's another example. In 1978, Democrats did relatively well in the Carter midterms. They lost, I think it was like 14 seats in the House. It was not a landslide for Republicans at all. And then 2 years later, it was an absolute bloodbath for Democrats. So any argument where you're trying to say 2024 is going to be X because 2022 was Y is an argument that I don't think has any sort of basis with the historical record.
All right. Now, I think in our pre-show chats the past few days, I mentioned that I thought that the House might actually swing a little bit to keep in the Democrat hold. And I think both of you guys are like, nah, it's probably still going to stay Republican. That source that I was reading was that same gentleman. So I got a couple more of those. So just as soon as you read it, you want to shoot it down, that's fine. This is more of a read and react thing. Let me get the next one up. Okay, this is a friend of mine on Facebook.
That would be perfectly in line with the average generic ballot polling error average. So to his first point, it is looking like it's going to end up being about R plus 3 to 4 when all the votes are still, obviously they're still counting a handful of votes still in California and a few other states, but based on the numbers that we're seeing right now, it's looking like the final result is going to be in that 3 to 4 range, probably closer to 3. The unusual part of this election is that generally the generic ballot overestimates how many seats the Democrats win by 10 points or so. That's only really a recent phenomenon. It's only been really post 2016 that the polling has been just massively overshooting Democrat chances. The polling was actually relatively accurate in 2012. here the generic ballot is probably going to overestimate the Republican seat gain by 3 seats or so. Well, it certainly did. Depending on the ballots that you looked at or the polling that you looked at, it definitely does look like that Republicans certainly underperformed the polling. It looks like many safe seats, Republicans overperform, but many that is definitely true. I made that argument earlier. But many competitive seats, they underperform, creating this divergence in the House popular vote and the actual seat gain. That is almost exactly what I argued earlier in the show, actually. So I agree with what he was saying when it looked like the final results. It's looking like it's going to end up being about R+3. And I also agree with the body in the second and third paragraph. I just wanted to remind people that it wasn't always this case where polling just constantly overshoots Democrats. That wasn't the case in 2012, for example. And yeah, I 100% agree with his conclusion there, right there in the last paragraph.
Similar thoughts, Mr. Sam? I think you muted or... Okay.
Sorry, nothing to add. I think that was a good summary.
All right, and I'll delete that overlay too. All right. As the cat does the zoomies around the room. All right, let's go on to the next one here.
Well, this guy. I mean, look, I think there's been a lot of humility among people who predict elections. I actually stopped predicting elections. I can tell you what seats are going to be competitive, but I think I've been doing this for a long time. The really close seats, it's just so unpredictable that you really don't know what's going to happen. And so, you know, I think both sides kind of predicting, you know, I knew the Democrats were going to win, or I knew it wasn't going to be that good for the Republicans. It's you never know if the person actually did some sort of correct analysis, or it's just they got lucky this time. Anyways, all that's to say is I always take political punditry, political predictions with a grain of salt. Everyone after the election was right. You know, so anyways, I encourage people to kind of think about seats more as competitive versus non-competitive, and not so much about I'm going to predict the exact margin someone's going to win by, because I just think it's very difficult these days.
Any initial reactions, Mr. Christian, to this?
As somebody who, until this cycle, has traditionally been extremely bearish on Republican chances, certainly in Virginia, I'm much more known for my successful predictions within Virginia state level politics, not necessarily federal elections.
Awards for it.
Yes, I have. So I just look. Going back to what we said earlier, people don't necessarily pay attention to what, folks like him or me or Sam or you or any of us have to say on Twitter. I think that the broader electorate just has other stuff going on. So, for you to say oh, I called this, so therefore everything else that I have to say about politics, right? I got one election right, so therefore everything else I have to say about politics must be true. And the independents, are thinking the same way that I am. Just the historical record is very clear that it doesn't play out like that. You might get it right one year perfectly, and then another year you become embarrassed. So the people that got it right this cycle, they might get everything wrong in 2 years or in 1 year. And the people that got it right a year or two ago, a lot of them, including myself, got many things wrong this cycle. So, I'm not going to say don't try to predict elections, because I find it to be very fun. Even outside of my own, political feeling. I mean, there's been plenty of times where I predicted that Republicans would get wiped out, even though I don't want them to. Right. And so, I do it not because I'm a partisan hack. I do it because I enjoy doing this stuff. But I also have a little bit of humility in that I know that I shouldn't take myself too seriously, because there's more than enough chances for me or anybody else to get it massively wrong.
Correct. And I'm thinking a couple things along this line that, I play fantasy football. I'm in 3 leagues, and I know how having your best information going into a week and making all of the guys could fail miserably. And I wonder if you just make a little correlation right here, that politics and sometimes is as fickle as fantasy football. And which is odd, because we like to think that, people should pay attention to politics more than they do something like fantasy football. And then they'll just turn out like we do, where we're going to be massively wrong going into November, or massively right. And it's just, I don't want to say it's luck, because I know both of you guys look into this like statisticians. So it's not like that this isn't serious. And I trust both of you guys. That's why I have you on specifically for that. And I got 2 more overlays before I delete them both, and we go on to that last question. So how about, I guess this is just dunking on Lindsey Graham.
I mean, that's a very easy thing to do. I'll dunk on Lindsey Graham all day long, and I'm a Republican.
But we might save that one because that is regarding the messaging one. So let's save about, I think Lindsey's specifically trying to say that this is a messaging thing for Republicans, and we'll, again, save that one for that last prepared question. And let me bring in the last overlay.
I like this guy.
Yeah, I think he's in California, which is why he follows.
Yeah.
At least he admitted hubris laced with overconfidence influenced my judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We haven't really talked a lot about California. I think both in California and New York, I think it's good to look at what happened in Virginia in 2021, where, as Christian mentioned, there was kind of an idea that Virginia is a blue state now, and obviously California and New York are a lot bluer than Virginia. But I think it's a good lesson, and places like more traditionally red states where Democrats were able to do decent this cycle, like maybe somewhere like Kansas. It's a good reminder to both parties to always work, never take your voters for granted, don't assume you're owed an election, you're entitled to an election. I think you really, it's just healthy for democracy if both parties, even in obviously some seats are going to be very safe, but even in kind of places where you think you're going to win, to at least try, don't take your voters for granted. So anyways, I'll end it with that.
All right, so let's focus here on the concept of messaging. And you both are very bright guys. I specifically wanted you two to come on to discuss this topic because you guys look at it more than just heavy partisans to say that. It's more like you guys just look at numbers and you treat it diligently. So first, I'd like to try something brand new here. Mr. Sam, I'd like you to think of messaging for the Republicans going forward. Let's say if you were just now hired as going in Virginia, going into a national election in 24, you're hired for a Republican firm. How would you, actually a Democrat, message for them? And then we're going to do the same thing for Mr. Christian.
Yeah. So who knows what the economic situation is going to be like, but I think to Jen Kagan's credit, she was able to stay pretty focused on economic stuff. And, I could be wrong. This is just my read as a Democrat, but I think the more Republicans talk about what normal people care about, like cost of living issues and inflation, that tends to help them. The more they kind of go down the, Fox News rabbit hole, and I think yesterday there was like a hearing on Hunter. There was a press conference about Hunter Biden. Average people are just like, what's going on? And then also the kind of social issues in terms of, we haven't talked a lot about abortion, but I do know that it was a strong motivator for people who felt passionately about that. And the more the Republicans kind of are willing to push bans, that's not going to be in their interest. So the more they're willing to maybe pivot from social issues to maybe some of the more economic issues. Now, I'm curious to hear Christian's reaction to that, although I know you're going to ask him about the Democratic message, but because I think the Republicans are divided on that, and sometimes they say, well, we ran on economics more in 2012 and we lost. And so anyways, I just, that was my only observation. I think the more like someone like Vega talked a lot about, not a lot, but she talked more about social issues than Kiggins did, and it didn't really help her too much, in my opinion. So
the Democrats probably would have tried to get Kiggins to try to talk about that, and she ducked it pretty well.
Yeah, but that's also being disciplined. I mean, so anyways, but I want to hear. I don't know if Christian wants to respond to that, or you're gonna ask him about what Democrats.
Yeah, I'd love to respond as long as you respond in kind when I answer my side of the question.
Perfect.
To Sam's point, I mean, I think it's important to differentiate between certain issues that are like base issues that you cannot afford to alienate people in your party. So you can only do so much quote unquote pivoting on, say, abortion without losing your own party's voters. So Republicans and Democrats, for that matter, have to, recognize and respect the fact that there's a good chunk of their party base that cares deeply about that issue for different reasons, right? But there are other issues where there's no extreme moral, heartfelt feeling on that. A good example of this is, I think that some of the general culture war stuff, I'd like to split the culture war in half. There's some culture war stuff that actually, I think, matters to people across the political spectrum, and the reasons for caring about it are, I think, legitimate reasons. But then there's an element of the culture war that's mostly fought on Twitter that I don't think is necessarily a legitimate thing. It's stuff that the news cycle picks up. It's stuff that Fox News or MSNBC will pick up because it gets ratings. But it is not a moral crisis for you to focus on to the same degree that you have to care about some of these other issues that people, point to and directly affect people. So I think that the problem that a lot of Republicans had, I mean, a good example of this is just baseless claims of voter fraud. Like, can an election be stolen? Yes. If an election is decided by 2 votes, you can steal it. But how many elections are decided by 2 votes? When people lose elections by 1 point, what that means is something like 80,000 votes in some states, right? And so it's much more difficult to actually pull off a true vote rigging stealing an election when you're talking about tens and tens, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of votes. For some local race where it's like 5 votes, yeah, sure, do a recount, do an audit. We should pass laws to make it easier to have transparency there. And I certainly think that Republicans are right to push for it in certain circumstances. But the Republicans, I feel like, not as a whole, but certain elements of the party want to use voter fraud as an excuse for losing every single election that they lose. And that's just not factually correct. It's not true. Could it be the case for 1% of the races that they lose because of voter fraud, where it's decided by a handful of votes? Sure. But that's not the reason that every single Republican loses. Here's a good example. If voter fraud is the reason that Republicans lose elections, why did Ron Johnson win in Wisconsin, but the Republican nominee for governor lost? What, did the Democrats forget to rig one of the 2 ballots that was taking place at the same time? Like, there's so many examples of this where it doesn't make sense. So I think Sam's kind of onto something when he says that the more that Republicans focus on bread and butter issues that actually affect voters, personally affect their lives, rather than pursuing things that simply are in the potentially the best interest of the party as an apparatus, right? Because fixing voter fraud, even in cases where it doesn't exist, that's not going to improve the personal life of somebody who's being crippled by generationally high inflation and just got laid off of their job, right? Fixing the voter machines doesn't change the fact that they're unemployed. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, give up on things that Republicans care about when it comes to things like voter ID and stuff like that. But focus on issues that voters care about, not that party activists care about. And to answer Conrad's question to me, if I was a Democrat political operative, one of the things that I would do is I would look at what Tim Ryan did in Ohio. He lost, but he did much better than he should have done in a state that has been zooming to the right for the past 5 years or so. And Tim Ryan's campaign, I think, was flawless in the sense that he talked about issues that his constituents, his would-be constituents, actually cared about, many of which were inclined to not vote for him, but actually changed their mind and ultimately did, despite the fact that they had voted for Trump before, in many cases twice. And what Ryan did is that he went out to communities that had voted for Democrats in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, but hadn't in the last 5 or 10 years or so, and said, look, I know that you have not voted for a Democrat before, at least in the past decade or so. I can tell you right now that my number one priority is tackling inflation, tackling the rising cost of gas and groceries, tackling the fact that jobs and manufacturing are moving out of Ohio. If you want a culture, he even had an ad where he said, if you want a culture warrior, I'm not your guy. But if you want a guy that will fight for every single person in this state from an economic standpoint, I will be your champion. And he made that personal connection where he made it clear to people in that state that I care about the fact that inflation is hurting you. I recognize that inflation is hurting you. There were a lot of Democrats that refused to even admit that inflation was a problem this election cycle. It was just a couple weeks ago that Nancy Pelosi said, when inflation comes up, we need to change the subject. And I remember that it was this administration that recently, it was just a few months ago that they were saying, actually at this point, now that we're at the end of 2022, it was about a year ago that there were people in this administration that were saying that inflation is a high class problem. So you had a combination of completely ignoring the problem, dismissing the problem, or telling voters that they shouldn't care about it. Your job, if you're running for office, is not to tell voters what they should care about. Your job, if you're running for office, is to recognize what they care about and then offer solutions to the problems that voters care so much about that they're going to go into a voting booth and vote based off of it. And I think Tim Ryan did that by making inflation and jobs in the economy his number one issue. And again, the only reason he lost was because Ohio has moved that far to the right. But that's not that is not a ding against him as a candidate or the campaign that he ran. He actually ran. If I had to grade his campaign, I would grade it. The most critical I could grade it would be like an A-.
Mm-hmm. All right. So before we get to our sort of conclusions here amongst each other, let's do one little thing here. And that's Sam wanted to respond in kind.
Yeah.
Christian,
I definitely agree with all that in the sense that you shouldn't write off voters and you should meet voters where they are. And I think, he had other issues, but I think that was one thing John Fetterman did really well. He actually went to a lot of parts of Pennsylvania Democrats had given up on, and Democrats did much better in a lot of that part of Virginia. And I'm in deep blue Arlington, but I hope Democrats will also look at all parts of Virginia, including Southwest Virginia, and places where they've really fallen off the map. Because I think it's healthy for democracy for both parties to be competing for all sorts of voters. And so I mean, all that's to say is you meet voters where they are, and you don't write off voters, and even if you don't end up winning a county, for example, even if you move up your margins a little bit, it can help. So I think that's a good idea from Tim Ryan's campaign, and also just talking about the issues that they care about, not that what you care about. What the voters care about is what ultimately matters. So we've touched. I think that's true for both parties, and I think that's a good way to end it.
Well, I want to sort of tie in here 23, and I know the first one is actually going to be SD7 because Kickens now has to go to Congress. And we have a very popular Virginia Beach City Councilman, Aaron Rouse, who is now running for that and has the Democratic nod. And I believe Admiral Keith Adams is going to represent the Republicans on here. So does anyone want to take a shot at what might happen in SD7 before we prognosticate? And I know, Christian, you don't like to be called a prognosticator, but we're 2023 is like a month and a half away. What is that going to look like, 2023? And we'll go whoever wants to speak.
So do you want to talk about the special election in combination?
23, yeah.
Okay, I mean that special election, it's kind of exciting because it's very rare for the special election to be in a toss-up seat, like a pure toss-up, and I think here it really is something where I joke about this on Twitter. It really comes down to turnout. I mean, Democrats won that district this year in terms of the congressional vote. Now, state elections are a little bit different, but there are enough Democratic voters in that district. If they get them out, they can win. But in special elections, traditionally the idea is Democrats don't always turn out. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a really interesting race. I really can't predict who's going to win because it's very rare to have a special election in a pure toss-up seat. And 2023 is going to be very interesting because I've been looking at the maps and the way the special masters drew them. I think there's a lot of safe seats on both sides. So the number of kind of deciding toss-up seats is going to be down to not that many. And so I think, it's going to be exciting to see what those races look like. And the Democrats are going to try to, if I had to guess, make the abortion issue kind of come to the surface because of the issue of unified control of the government. So of state government. So anyways, not to ramble too much, but I can't predict anything. I just know that it's going to be interesting. I think there's a lot of close districts that will decide it. And so all I can say is stay tuned. It's a little too early to know what's going to happen.
Any thoughts, Mr. Christian?
The special election will be really interesting. Not just because of redistricting, but also because of the nature in terms of, as Sam pointed out, it's very rare that we get a special election in a seat like this. So I do think it'll come down, the old cliche of it'll come down to turnout. I mean, that's true in almost every election, right? But it will certainly be true in this case, especially because it is a special election. So, I mean, gun to my head, Republicans should hold it, but that's not necessarily me making a prediction that they will. Just because I'm saying they should hold it doesn't mean that they will hold it, right? So, I mean, if I had to give it a rating at the start, it would certainly start as a toss-up. If I was banned from choosing toss-up as an option, I would give it tilt Republican, which is like the least Republican that I could give it. So I mean, I also think, by the way, that the results of this election are not necessarily going to be indicative of the general election. And a good example of this is what happened with the Turpin versus Rocky Holcomb race for the House of Delegates in Virginia Beach that took place before the Republican bloodbath of 2017. So there was a special election for the House of Delegates in the northern part of Virginia Beach back in 2017, and Rocky Holcomb won. He beat Cheryl Turpin, and then in November he lost the seat to Cheryl Turpin. So and at the same time he won the special election, right? But later that year, Republicans got completely wiped out and almost lost complete control of the House of Delegates, despite the fact that they went into the election cycle almost having a supermajority. They went from 1 seat shy of a supermajority to 1 seat shy of losing control of the chamber in 1 cycle. So, and that was 1 cycle where at the beginning of the cycle, Republicans won a special election in a hotly contested, pretty much as pure of a toss-up district as you could possibly think of, right? So my point is that you could get a scenario where, say, for example, Democrats win the seat and then they lose control of the Senate chamber in November. Or you could get vice versa, right? You could have a situation where Republicans win the seat and then they end up failing to flip the chamber in November, or they lose seats in the chamber. So, just for your audience and people in general, like, just keep in mind that the results of this special election are not necessarily going to be indicative of what the general election is going to look like next November. Now, speaking to that point, it's looking like that the House is going to be more Republican leaning than the Senate. That doesn't necessarily mean that the House is going to stay in Republican hands, but I would not be surprised if the House ends up being more Republican than the Senate, regardless of what that margin ends up looking like. Another way to put it would be the Senate is going to be more Democrat than the House. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised if you get split government again, where the Senate is held by Democrats and the House is still held by Republicans. But then again, I wouldn't be surprised if Republicans flip the Senate and they actually have a trifecta, the first one since Bob McDonnell. It's also not out of the universe for Democrats to flip control of the House because of redistricting, and hold the Senate. And the crazy thing is that it's not entirely out of the picture for Democrats to flip one chamber and lose the other. I don't necessarily think that's the most likely outcome. That's probably the least likely outcome out of all of them. But what's interesting about this cycle is that there is at least a decent chance that anything could happen, in large part because redistricting has really changed everything. This is the first cycle in 10 years that we're operating under completely new maps for both chambers. It's been a whole generation of politicians coming and going with the old lines, and now, they're thrown out. So I think that Republicans are favored to flip the seat in Roanoke in the Senate, and Democrats are probably favored to flip the seat in Henrico. So that's kind of a wash right there. And it's really going to come down to what's going to happen to a couple of seats in South Side and Southeast Virginia, and what's going to happen to a couple of seats in Northern Virginia, particularly the one that's in Loudoun County. What happens in those districts is probably going to be what decides, the fate of the upper chamber. And for the lower chamber, it's really going to come down to basically a handful of districts in the Hampton Roads area and a handful of districts in the outer suburbs of Northern Virginia. So, you'll see a lot of, competition on both sides. And I don't know, we'll have to circle back around, in 11 or 10 months or so to have some more concrete predictions.
Excellent. Well, let's close out here. Mr. Christian Heiens, how do we follow you and stay up with you, and how do we watch you going forward to make sure that we are as most informed as we can be?
Well, if you are a fan of anything from the conservative perspective of politics, I am on the Making the Argument podcast with my friend and state delegate Nick Freitas. We put out 2 a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So you can find that anywhere where you get your podcast. That's Making the Argument. Me personally, if you're into military history, economics, and a little bit of politics, I try to keep the political hacking at an absolute minimum there on Twitter. I'm really more of a fan of the history side and the economic side, but I do talk about elections. I try to keep my own political biases at an absolute minimum when it comes to the elections themselves and the predictions and the modeling and the maps and that sort of stuff. So if you're into that, the Twitter handle is @Christian and the last name is Heiens. It's a weird way to spell Heinz, 3 vowels in a row. But those are probably the 2 best places that you can get in touch with me if you're interested in following me.
As long as Twitter still exists.
Yeah, as long as Twitter still exists. The jury's still out.
Yeah, I was going to add, I'm the same. I mainly am just on Twitter. I'm at Sam Shirazi M. So we'll see how long Twitter is around. I don't think I'm going to migrate over. It's Twitter or nothing for me. So I think, like Christian, I try to stay pretty objective, pretty nonpartisan. I try not to throw in the red meat or the blue meat for my side, to keep it pretty even-heeled. So hopefully, even if you don't always agree with my politics, you agree with my political takes, because I really do try to just look at the numbers and be fairly objective. So anyways, it was good to be on, and hopefully we can keep the Virginia politics conversations going.
Thank you guys so much. I hope on different topics we might be able to have you guys back on in the future, and hopefully I can have a more smooth transition at the start of the show. But again, thank you so much for coming on. I'm about to do my outros, and I'll catch you guys next time.
Cool. Take care, Conrad.
You too.
It's never too early or too late to plan for retirement. Let me show you how to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your assets from loss due to catastrophic decisions that may affect you the rest of your life. Please call me.
This show was brought to you by Positive Vibes Incorporated, our consulting services. We do credit fixes, we do tax resolution, we lend private money, and debt consolidation. So if you need some of these services, we're waiting here for you. Credit fixes, tax resolutions, private money, and debt consolidation. Make sure you call Positive Vibes Incorporated.